This sermon is the sixth in a series on the social principles of the United Methodist Church. I'm thinking we should give prizes to those who have subjected themselves to all 7 sermons. But let's not get ahead of ourselves because we still have today and next week. It's going to make you grateful to celebrate Lent. The focus of our consideration today is the section entitled The Political Community. And the last time I attempted such a sermon, not here at Messiah, mind you, it didn't go so well. Now, I think there were 2 reasons for that outcome. First, people have great passion about politics. Bishop Willimon recently observed, politics, as some have noted, has become our functional equivalent for God. The state has become the source of our security, meaning ultimate loyalty and purpose. So folks get highly sensitive when you start talking about politics, which is why your mother told you to never talk about it. Second, the biblical text doesn't make it any easier, despite what some preachers may have told you. And it resists any simplistic understandings of the relationship of theology to the political community. Now, I hope to make this clear in this sermon. But this is a warning that this is no jelly donut sermon. And before you share your displeasure on the way out the door, you need to make certain that you have listened carefully, because there will be nuance woven into the sermon that make attempts to criticize me much more difficult for you. As I have explored my family history, I've discovered a somewhat confusing political heritage that causes me to approach the subject matter before us this morning with some caution and humility. I learned that 2 of my ancestors, a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and his son, a great-great-great-great-grandfather, fought the British at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The son was wounded in that battle, so I guess I'm lucky to be here. Or you might want to say, you're unlucky. My mother was always proud of the fact that it would qualify me to join the sons of the American Revolution. But I also learned that my mother's side of the family had fought on a different side during the American Revolution. That ancestor came from Germany as a Hessian soldier to fight for the crown. He was captured in the Battle of Saratoga and brought to Virginia near Charlottesville, where they had a prisoner of war camp. At the end of the war, the Hessian soldiers were given the choice of going back to Germany or staying here. My ancestor, like many of those Hessian soldiers, decided to stay. So I have a somewhat contradictory political heritage. Just so you don't feel excluded this morning, let me assure you that you have a similar contradictory heritage as a United Methodist. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, remained loyal to the crown throughout the conflict. and he wrote tracts in support of the king. This fact caused Methodists in this country to be viewed with a great deal of suspicion. Francis Asbury, the father of American Methodism, had to hide out in a barn in Delaware during the Revolutionary War. When the war was over and the Bishop of London refused to send priests to the rebellious former colonies that had won their independence, Wesley sent a communion chalice to Francis Asbury by way of Thomas Coke, which is a church way of saying that it's more important to be loyal to God than to the monarch. So it may be instructive to be aware of our somewhat mixed or contradictory heritage when contemplating Christian theology in the political community. To hear some churches talk about it, there's no distinction between Christian faith and politics. This fusion of religious values and political values in such a way that one can no longer distinguish the two is what sociologists call civil religion, and it can undermine the role of religious communities in a society. The rise of civil religion in Nazi Germany, in which the church uncritically blessed the Nazi regime in the name of God and compromised its theological understandings in order to appease the agenda of the Nazis, remains a troubling chapter in church history, which unfortunately is only one of many such chapters. Our notions about the separation of church and state are an attempt to write a different kind of history. But if we're too quick to claim Christian faith for our political agendas, it's a disservice to both the church and the nation. Our experiment in a wall of separation between church and the state intends to allow the church the right to maintain its own distinctive voice in the public square, so that it does not become a tool of other agendas, so that it can remain a voice which can always question and, if necessary, resist other agendas. Now, this is a privilege that the early church did not know, which is important to keep in mind when reading Scripture. There was no notion of separation of church and state in antiquity. Early Christians were charged with being atheists because they were viewed as disloyal to the emperor. Early Christians were not persecuted because they believed in Jesus as the Messiah, but because they refused to confess the emperor as Lord and God. When Thomas in the Gospel of John responds to the resurrected Jesus with the words, "My Lord and God," Dominus et Deus in Latin, the title he is using for Jesus is the same one that good patriotic Romans used for Caesar. Too much preaching about the relationship between the ruling powers and the one who rules the cosmos has too often made religion just another weapon in the arsenal of rulers serving nothing larger than themselves and their own self-serving interests. Such preaching tends to select a biblical passage in which people are told to be obedient to the ruling power, since it is God's will and God's sovereignty that this ruler has authority. It gives the ruling authority a sort of theological blank check, which will bankrupt a faithful Christian witness. Our first scripture reading from 1 Peter as one of these texts that are often used in ways that it instructs its readers to be obedient to the ruler. One of my seminary professors, now in heaven by the name of Christian Becker, taught us an important hermeneutical principle. The word hermeneutical simply refers to our methods of interpreting the Bible, and we all have hermeneutical principles. You may just not recognize your hermeneutical principles, or you may not want to acknowledge them, but everyone's got them. Becker and his brother had escaped a Nazi firing squad during World War II, which gave him somewhat of a bias against German biblical scholarship. And he taught us to distinguish between what he called coherence and contingency. By coherence, he meant those consistent core teachings of the biblical text, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. By contingency, he meant those aspects of the biblical text that reflect a particular time and a particular culture that was never meant to be made absolute. For instance, polygamy, which is clearly practiced in the biblical text. We can be faithful to God and not practice polygamy, just in case you didn't know. When reading the Bible, it's helpful to distinguish between coherence and contingency. We get ourselves confused when we confuse the two. 1 Peter is written to a particular group of people in a particular time and setting in which we can assume that the rulers were behaving like they should. The writer does note that they have the authority to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. The recipients of the letter were being called upon to be obedient so that Christians would maintain a good reputation, so they wouldn't be an embarrassment to God. I don't think that the writer had the intention of making that a command for all times, in all situations, and most importantly, all rulers. Now, we get a very different take on the relationship between Christians and ruling authorities in our scripture reading from the book of Revelation, written by John, who is a prisoner because he was a good Christian. There's a debate about when Revelation was written, whether it was the reign of Nero or Domitian, but clearly a bad ruler who was treating Christians badly. We're treated to a vision of heaven where we are told about those who have come through the great ordeal and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. The irony of the metaphors challenges us to understand that they had paid the ultimate price because of their disobedience to the ruler in order to remain faithful to God. Later on in the 17th chapter, the ruler is described as a beast who will make war on the Lamb. And then, most shocking of all, we are told that the Lamb will conquer. Now, if it was a stallion or an eagle, but a lamb, it's a shocking image of how God intends to conquer and rule. But the point is that Revelation gives us a very different impression about how Christians relate to the ruling powers. They resist, and if necessary, pay the ultimate price. Now, this is likely more than what we wanted when we came to church this morning. Just the donuts and sausage biscuits, please. And probably why readings like 1 Peter get used a lot as we twist the meaning of that passage and blame God for whoever happens to be in charge. As we think about the very different readings embodied in 1 Peter and Revelation, I want to suggest that both reflect the spirit of the reading from Matthew, in which religious leaders are trying to entrap Jesus, which should be a warning to you about religious leaders. The question concerns paying taxes, a subject that we're all too painfully aware of at this time of the year. Jesus answers their supposed question by saying, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." It's always interesting to me to hear how people interpret that saying, often claiming that it means that we should pay our taxes. But my reading of the text is that Jesus did not answer the question, but rather created another question. What is the emperor's? And what is God's? His response challenged his listeners then and now to take responsibility and determine what belongs to the emperor and what belongs to God. I think that's why they didn't ask him a follow-on question. Jesus was very good at shifting the responsibility back to where it belongs. So the first lesson about religion and politics becomes one about taking responsibility, supporting the ruling authorities when it's compatible with our understandings of what it means to follow Jesus, and questioning as well as resisting when it's incompatible with our understandings of what it means to follow Jesus. As I've tried to suggest in other sermons, our first loyalty is always to following Jesus. And I'm not as concerned about what rights the American Constitution gives me as I am about what Jesus expects of me. Now, will we all agree about what Jesus expects of us? Now, some things, maybe. On others, highly doubtful. Bishop Willimon writes, "It's the nature of the Christian faith to be rather messy, to include a variety of voices and perspectives. So that means that when you ask Christians, what do you think we ought to do on this particular political issue, you're going to hear a variety of voices. And no one can lay claim to being the one authoritative, uncontested Christian voice." Later, reflecting on our reading from Matthew, Willimon shares, "Note that Jesus doesn't answer the question. He doesn't really define what Caesar owns and what God owns. That means when it comes to politics, maybe the Christian point of view is to be permanently uneasy, never quite sure, when we're giving to Caesar what really belongs to God. This says to me that if Christians are going to get in bed with Caesar, if we're going to be deeply involved in politics, we ought to be tossing and turning all night, the most nervous and uneasy of bedfellows. As I've contemplated my somewhat awkward and contradictory political heritage, the son of two different sides fighting against one another, I've thought about how it might be good to have an organization for people to remember this kind of heritage. It might be called Sons of American Political Hypocrisy, or maybe Daughters of American Political Contradictions. But then I realized that I already belong to something much more honest and challenging and helpful: the Church of Jesus Christ.